There is a question that quietly haunts kind people, usually late at night, usually after another disappointment they didn't see coming. Why does being good to others so rarely protect you from being hurt by them? I asked myself that question for years before I understood the answer, and the answer, once I finally accepted it, was far less comforting than I hoped it would be. Kindness was never a shield. It was never designed to be one. Somewhere along the way, nice people are taught to believe that goodness functions like armor, that if you treat people well enough, consistently enough, generously enough, the world will eventually treat you the same way in return. That belief isn't just wrong. It's dangerous, because it keeps good people standing in situations that are actively harming them, waiting for a fairness that was never guaranteed in the first place. I think the first mistake nice people make, and I made it for most of my life, is confusing kindness with safety. Kindness is a way of treating others. Safety requires boundaries, discernment, and the willingness to withdraw your goodness from people who consistently abuse it. Those are two entirely different skills, and having one does not automatically grant you the other. In fact, the very qualities that make someone genuinely kind, empathy, patience, a willingness to extend the benefit of the doubt, are often the exact qualities that make them vulnerable to people who have no interest in reciprocating that same treatment. I remember believing, with real conviction, that if I was patient enough with someone's difficult behavior, they would eventually recognize my patience and respond to it with the same care I was offering them. That belief kept me in situations far longer than I should have stayed, waiting for a shift in behavior that other people had no intention of making, because they had already learned, through my own patience, that they didn't need to change anything. My kindness, rather than inspiring reciprocity, had quietly become permission. People took more because I gave more, not because they were moved by my generosity, but because generosity, when it's never protected by boundaries, functions as an open invitation to keep taking. This is the part that took me the longest to accept, because it feels almost cruel to admit. Nice people often get hurt not despite their kindness, but partly because of how that kindness gets used by people who recognize it as an exploitable resource. I don't say this to blame kind people for their own suffering. The responsibility for exploitation always belongs to the person doing the exploiting. But understanding the mechanism matters, because without understanding it, kind people keep repeating the same pattern, assuming that the solution to being hurt is simply to be even kinder, when the actual solution often requires the opposite instinct entirely, becoming more selective, more boundaried, more willing to withhold generosity from people who have demonstrated they don't deserve it. I had to learn, slowly and with real discomfort, that kindness without discernment isn't a virtue, it's a vulnerability. Discernment is the ability to distinguish between people who will treat your generosity with respect and people who will treat it as an opportunity. Nice people, particularly those raised to believe that suspicion or caution is itself a character flaw, often skip this step entirely. They extend the same warmth to everyone, regardless of how that warmth has been received in the past, because withholding it feels like a betrayal of who they believe themselves to be. That instinct, admirable in theory, becomes dangerous in practice when it prevents you from noticing who has actually earned continued access to your generosity and who hasn't. Another reason nice people get hurt so often involves a specific kind of self-erasure that tends to accompany chronic kindness. Somewhere along the way, many kind people learn that their own needs are less important than everyone else's comfort. This lesson rarely arrives as an explicit statement. It arrives gradually, through small moments where expressing a need felt like causing inconvenience, where asking for something felt selfish, where accommodating someone else's preference always seemed to matter more than honoring your own. Over time, those small moments accumulate into a deeply held belief that your worth depends on how little you require from others, and that belief makes you an easy target for anyone willing to take advantage of it. I recognized this pattern in myself when I noticed how automatically I apologized, even for things that weren't remotely my fault, how quickly I backed down during disagreements, even when I was clearly right, how instinctively I minimized my own discomfort to avoid disrupting someone else's mood. None of that behavior came from genuine kindness toward others. It came from a deep, unexamined belief that my own needs were somehow less legitimate, less worthy of protection than everyone else's. People who are naturally inclined to take advantage of others can sense that belief almost immediately, not because they're uniquely perceptive, but because someone who habitually minimizes their own needs signals without meaning to, that pushing past their boundaries will rarely be met with real resistance. This is why nice people often find themselves surrounded by people who take more than they give. It isn't bad luck. It's a pattern created by the specific combination of genuine generosity and insufficient self-protection. People who are inclined to exploit kindness are drawn, consciously or not, toward those who make exploitation easy. And few things make exploitation easier than someone who has already been conditioned to believe that setting limits is unkind, that saying no is selfish, that their own comfort matters less than everyone else's convenience. I had to unlearn that conditioning slowly, and with a great deal of resistance from my own instincts. Every time I tried to set a boundary, some part of me flinched, convinced I was being cruel, convinced that a genuinely good person wouldn't need to protect themselves this way. It took years to understand that boundaries aren't the opposite of kindness. They are what allow kindness to remain sustainable rather than becoming a slow, silent form of self-destruction. Without boundaries, kindness eventually curdles into resentment, exhaustion, and a quiet erosion of self-respect, none of which serve anyone, including the people you were originally trying to be kind toward. Nice people also tend to get hurt because they consistently misjudge other people's character based on potential rather than pattern. I did this constantly, extending trust based on who I believed someone could become, rather than who their actual behavior had already shown them to be. I told myself stories about people's difficult circumstances, their complicated histories, their unrealized capacity for change, using those stories to justify continuing to extend trust that their actual behavior had never earned. That tendency comes from a genuinely generous place, a belief in people's capacity to grow and improve. But it becomes dangerous when it consistently overrides the more immediate, more reliable evidence of how someone is actually treating you right now, in the present, regardless of what they might become someday. I learned eventually that pattern is always more trustworthy than potential. Someone's demonstrated behavior over time tells you far more about how they will treat you going forward than any story about who they could become if circumstances were different. Nice people, hopeful by nature, often ignore this in favor of a more generous interpretation, and that generosity, however well-intentioned, leaves them repeatedly vulnerable to people who have already shown, through actual behavior, that they aren't capable of treating kindness with the respect it deserves. There's also a particular kind of naivety that often accompanies genuine kindness. Not naivety about the world in general, but naivety specifically about how differently other people's internal motivations can operate compared to your own. Kind people tend to assume, often without realizing it, that everyone operates from a similar internal logic, that if they wouldn't take advantage of someone's generosity, others probably wouldn't either. That assumption, while understandable, simply isn't accurate. Some people operate from a fundamentally different internal calculation, one where generosity is measured not as a gift to be honored, but as an opportunity to be leveraged. Recognizing that difference doesn't require becoming cynical about humanity in general. Most people, thankfully, do operate with some baseline of reciprocity and respect, but some people don't, and nice people, hopeful and generous by nature, often struggle to fully internalize that a small percentage of the people they encounter genuinely do think this way, viewing kindness as weakness rather than as strength. Until you accept that this population exists and learn to recognize its patterns early, you remain vulnerable to repeatedly extending trust to people who were never going to treat it with any real regard. I also had to confront an uncomfortable truth about how nice people often handle red flags when they do notice them. Even when something feels wrong, even when a specific behavior raises a genuine concern, kind people often talk themselves out of trusting that instinct, assuming the best, giving the benefit of the doubt, reminding themselves that everyone deserves patience and understanding. That instinct toward generosity, applied without discernment, becomes a direct pathway toward repeated harm. Red flags exist because they're informative. Ignoring them in favor of maintaining a generous interpretation doesn't make the underlying behavior less real. It simply delays the moment you're forced to confront it, usually after more damage has already been done. I had to learn to trust discomfort as valid information rather than something to be immediately explained away. This felt, at first, like a betrayal of the generous person I believed myself to be. Over time, I understood that trusting your own discomfort isn't the opposite of kindness. It's a form of self-respect that allows genuine kindness to be directed toward people who will actually honor it, rather than being wasted repeatedly on people who have already shown you, through specific and repeated behavior, that they won't. Another reason nice people get hurt involves how they handle conflict, or more precisely, how they avoid it. Genuine kindness often gets confused with an aversion to confrontation, a belief that a truly good person should be endlessly agreeable, should avoid friction at almost any cost, should prioritize harmony over honesty even when honesty is what the situation actually requires. This confusion leads kind people to swallow legitimate grievances, avoid necessary confrontations, and allow harmful patterns to continue simply because addressing them directly feels uncomfortable and somehow unkind. I spent years operating this way, avoiding necessary conflict because I had internalized the belief that nice people don't create friction, don't make others uncomfortable, don't risk disrupting a relationship by naming something that's actually wrong. That avoidance over time taught the people around me that I could be pushed indefinitely without consequence, because I had demonstrated repeatedly that I would rather absorb harm silently than risk the discomfort of addressing it directly. Learning to tolerate that discomfort, to have the necessary conversation even when it felt deeply unnatural, was one of the hardest and most important shifts I ever made. I think it's worth naming clearly that genuine kindness and conflict avoidance are not the same thing, even though they often masquerade as each other. Genuine kindness sometimes requires exactly the kind of honest confrontation that conflict avoidance is designed to prevent. Telling someone honestly that their behavior has hurt you, holding them accountable for a pattern that needs to change, refusing to pretend everything is fine when it clearly isn't. These are all acts of genuine care both for yourself and ultimately for the relationship itself. Avoiding that honesty in the name of niceness isn't actually kind. It's a quiet form of self-abandonment disguised as generosity towards someone else. I also had to reckon with how often nice people extend forgiveness prematurely, before any real accountability or change has actually occurred. Forgiveness offered too quickly and too automatically can become another mechanism through which kind people repeatedly absorb harm without requiring the person who caused it to actually address the underlying behavior. I used to forgive almost instantly, treating quick forgiveness as evidence of my own goodness, without pausing to consider whether the person being forgiven had done anything to actually earn that forgiveness, beyond simply asking for it or waiting long enough for my anger to fade. Real forgiveness, I eventually understood, isn't the same as immediate absolution. It can coexist with boundaries, with consequences, with a slower rebuilding of trust that depends on actual demonstrated change rather than simply the passage of time or the comfort of moving past discomfort quickly. Nice people often skip that slower, more discerning process, offering forgiveness reflexively because withholding it feels unkind, and in doing so, they inadvertently teach the people around them that harmful behavior carries no real cost, that kindness will always eventually smooth things over, regardless of whether any actual repairs has taken place. Looking back across all of this, I think the deepest reason nice people get hurt is that kindness on its own was never designed to function as a complete operating system for navigating the world. It's an essential ingredient, but it requires partners it doesn't naturally come with: discernment, boundaries, the willingness to trust your own discomfort, the willingness to confront rather than avoid, the willingness to require real change before extending forgiveness. Kindness without those partners doesn't protect you. It simply makes you generous toward people who may or may not deserve it, without any mechanism for telling the difference in advance. I don't think the answer to any of this is becoming less kind. Kindness, tempered with discernment, remains one of the most valuable qualities a person can offer the world, and most of the people you encounter will treat it with the respect it deserves. But learning to pair that kindness with boundaries, with pattern recognition, with the willingness to withdraw generosity from people who consistently abuse it, protects you from repeatedly finding yourself hurt by the very quality that makes you good in the first place. Nice people don't need to become harder. They need to become wiser about who their softness is actually being offered to, and courageous enough to withhold it from those who have already shown, through their own behavior, that they were never going to honor it. There is another dimension to this that took me even longer to understand, and it involves the specific stories nice people tell themselves to explain away their own pain after being hurt. I noticed a pattern in myself, and later in other kind people I knew, of immediately searching for a way to understand the person who had hurt us, rather than fully processing the hurt itself. We would ask what happened in their childhood, what pressures they might be under, what pain of their own might explain their harmful behavior, often within moments of being wounded by them. That instinct toward understanding is admirable in isolation, but when it happens automatically, before you've even allowed yourself to feel the impact of what occurred, it functions as a way of skipping past your own experience in favor of centering someone else's. I had to learn to separate understanding from excusing, because for a long time I had unconsciously treated them as the same thing. Understanding why someone might behave a certain way doesn't require you to excuse the impact of that behavior on you, and it certainly doesn't require you to continue absorbing it indefinitely, simply because you've identified a sympathetic explanation for it. Nice people often extend endless understanding toward the people who hurt them, while extending very little understanding toward their own pain, treating their own hurt as something to quickly explain away, rather than something equally deserving of attention and care. This imbalance, I think, comes from a deeper belief that kind people often carry without examining it closely. The belief that their own feelings are somehow less urgent, less important, less worthy of protection than everyone else's. That belief doesn't announce itself directly. It shows up in small moments, in how quickly you move past your own hurt to focus on someone else's explanation for causing it, and how readily you offer comfort to people who have wronged you before you've allowed yourself any comfort at all. Recognizing that imbalance was uncomfortable, because it required admitting that my supposed selflessness had, in some ways, become a mechanism for avoiding my own pain, rather than a genuine expression of generosity toward others. I also noticed that nice people often struggle to accurately gauge how much they've actually given in a relationship, because keeping score feels, to them, like something ungenerous people do. This reluctance to track reciprocity, admirable in its intention to avoid pettiness, often leaves kind people unable to recognize just how imbalanced a relationship has become until the imbalance is severe enough to become undeniable. By the time that recognition arrives, considerable damage has usually already been done, both to the relationship and to the kind person's own sense of self-worth. I started, somewhat reluctantly, keeping a more honest internal account of reciprocity in my closest relationships, not out of pettiness, but out of genuine self-protection. This wasn't about literally tallying favors or keeping score in a transactional way. It was about honestly noticing over time whether the general direction of care and effort flowed in both directions or consistently in one. That honest noticing, uncomfortable at first because it felt like a betrayal of the generous person I believed myself to be, eventually became one of the most protective habits I developed, allowing me to recognize imbalance far earlier than I would have otherwise. Another pattern I had to examine involved how nice people often respond to being taken advantage of by trying even harder rather than pulling back. This response seems paradoxical until you understand the underlying logic driving it. If a kind person's core belief is that goodness should be rewarded with goodness, then encountering someone who takes advantage of their kindness creates a kind of cognitive dissonance. Rather than questioning the belief itself, many kind people instead conclude that they simply haven't been kind enough yet, that more generosity, more patience, more accommodation will eventually produce the reciprocity they've been expecting all along. This response traps kind people in an escalating cycle, where being taken advantage of leads not to appropriate boundary setting, but to even greater vulnerability, as they offer more and more of themselves in a mistaken effort to finally earn the treatment they deserve from the very beginning. I recognized this pattern in my own life more than once, noticing how my response to feeling unappreciated was almost always to become more accommodating rather than less, as though the solution to not being valued was simply to provide more value, rather than to reconsider whether the person receiving that value was capable of appreciating it in the first place. Breaking this cycle required a genuine shift in how I understood the relationship between giving and receiving. I had operated, for years, under the assumption that giving more would eventually produce a proportional return, as though relationships functioned according to a kind of moral physics, where effort always eventually generates reciprocity. Real relationships don't work this way. Some people will never reciprocate your generosity, regardless of how much of it you offer, not because you haven't given enough, but because reciprocity was never something they were inclined to offer in the first place. Recognizing that distinction between people who simply need more time and patience and people who fundamentally don't operate with reciprocity as part of their character became essential to protecting myself from the exhausting cycle of escalating generosity in pursuit of appreciation that was never coming. I think it's also worth naming how nice people often struggle with the specific fear that setting boundaries will make them into someone they don't want to be, cold, selfish, difficult, the exact opposite of the kind person they've always understood themselves as. This fear kept me from setting necessary boundaries for a long time, because I had conflated the presence of boundaries with the absence of kindness, as though the two couldn't coexist within the same person. Eventually I understood that this fear, while understandable, rests on a false premise. Boundaries don't erase kindness. They determine who has access to it, and that determination, far from making you less kind, actually makes your kindness more meaningful, because it becomes something offered deliberately, rather than extracted automatically from someone unable to say no. I also had to accept that some people, upon encountering my new boundaries, would react with confusion, frustration, or outright anger, framing my newly protected kindness as a betrayal of the person they had grown accustomed to exploiting. That reaction, uncomfortable as it was to witness, ultimately confirmed something important. People who respond to reasonable boundaries with anger rather than respect were never actually valuing the person behind the kindness. They were valuing the access that kindness, unprotected, had always provided them. Losing access to that unprotected version of me revealed, more clearly than anything else could have, which relationships had been built on genuine mutual regard, and which had simply been built on convenient exploitation. If there's one thing I would want every genuinely kind person to understand, it's that protecting your own goodness isn't a betrayal of who you are. It's what allows that goodness to remain sustainable, rather than being slowly drained by people who were never going to honor it in the first place. Nice people get hurt not because kindness itself is a flaw, but because kindness, unaccompanied by discernment and boundaries, leaves you defenseless against the specific kind of person who has learned to recognize unprotected generosity as an opportunity. Learning to pair your natural goodness with the wisdom to know who deserves it doesn't make you less kind. It makes your kindness finally as strong and as lasting as it always deserved to be.